On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the ports of LA and Long Beach are drowning in empty containers. Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. So, the ports of LA and Long Beach are reporting downward trends in the number of containers they're moving for the months of October and November. This is at the same time that ports around the United States, Houston, Savannah, New York, New Jersey, are increasing the number of containers they're moving. So the question becomes, why is the port of LA and Long Beach, which has record number of vessels off the port far out to sea, but still waiting there to offload, why are they slowing down? And to get that perspective, Bloomberg interviewed the head of the Harbor Trucking Association, Matt Schrapp.
Thank you, Taylor. We describe the Port of LA as a many-tentacled beast, and one of those tentacles is the trucks and the truckers that come to take the containers away. Matt Schrapp, what is the problem that we have at the Port of LA right now?
As you mentioned, it's many-tentacled. For us, there's one acute issue that we deal with daily, and that's restrictions on empty container returns. We are drowning in empty containers here in this harbor and in our trucking yards, and that's a major issue for us.
So, empty containers are the issue that Matt Schrapp, the head of the Harbor Trucking Association, has identified. The question becomes, why is LA Long Beach experiencing this issue, whereas other ports have the issue, but it's not impacting as much? So let's break this down. High-tech YouTube channels have spiffy graphics. What's Going On with Shipping, have Lego Maersk vessels. And that's what we're going to use today for our demonstration. So what makes LA Long Beach different? So if you have a container ship that's going to the East Coast of the United States, typically it's going into 3-4 ports: New York, New Jersey, Virginia, Charleston, Savannah. And at each of those ports, the container ship would offload anywhere between 20 to 40% of their containers. They would be taking off slices from cells of containers for use. And those containers would be offloaded all the way down into the interior of the vessel. This doesn't have that. Then those empty containers, or containers going back to wherever the ship came from, Europe or Asia, would be backloaded onto the vessel. That means that each of the ports are handling just a portion of the total cargo of a ship. Therefore, the number of containers, which may be high, are being handled in small blocks at a time. Well, LA and Long Beach are different. LA and Long Beach, the average size of the vessel coming into LA and Long Beach is about 11,000 boxes. But instead of 20 to 40% of the containers coming off, 80% to 100% of the containers are coming off the vessel, which means that these ships are dumping nearly their entire cargo on the dock at LA and Long Beach at the same time. Now, sometimes these vessels will route to another port, maybe in Mexico, maybe Oakland, maybe Seattle, Tacoma, maybe Vancouver. Some vessels are dumping 100% of their cargo off in LA and Long Beach, meaning that the vessel is going to be completely empty and now it has to be reloaded. And understand, those container cranes, go back to the video we used on container cranes, can only load one cell at a time. So that as you're taking boxes off a cell, you're working your way down into the interior. You're not bringing containers back on. You can only move them on and off. They don't move side to side. These container cranes are locked in on the cells. But now you've dumped all those containers onto the ground. I'm going to move my Maersk vessel out of the way here. And now we're dealing with the containers ashore. And this is where we start seeing the issues that Matt Schrapp is talking about. So one of the things that has to be done is when a truck comes into the port of LA, it has on its back a container. Use this little yellow block right here. It has a container. Now, the reason it has a container on its back is because that chassis, which is driven out of the port originally, has that container and chassis together. Now, most ocean-going containers, the containers that go on the vessels, are not the containers you see going up and down the highway. What you see going up and down the highway are trailers, 40 to 53-foot containers. When the container is offload, let's take one of our Maersk boxes here. Pop off a Maersk box right here. We're going to pop off our little Maersk box. This box is going to be put on the back of a tractor trailer, and it is going to be taken to a distribution site or a warehouse to be offloaded. Now, the problem in Southern California is those warehouses have only a few percentage space available. And so those boxes may sit there waiting to be offloaded. And they're waiting and they're waiting. And sometimes they're on the back of a chassis. Well, truckers or drayage drivers make their money by the number of runs they make. So they're specified a set amount of hours to ride. And you'll hear this issue about there's a shortage of truck drivers. There's not a shortage of truck drivers. What there's a shortage of is the number of runs individual drivers are doing. An individual driver usually should do 2 to 3 calls a day. But because of the backlog, they're only able to do 1. So even if you add more trucks and more drivers into this, you're just adding to the congestion. So this container has to be taken to the warehouse. It sits at the warehouse, has to be offloaded. If there's no room in the warehouse to offload, it'll sit there on the back of its chassis and sit there and wait and wait and wait and wait. Eventually, once it's offloaded, a truck driver can pick this back up and bring it back to the port. Now, he's got to bring this empty back because he needs the chassis underneath it. It'd be great if he just had the chassis, but he has no place to put this empty container. So he has to bring it back to him. This stack you see right here now, this is the stack of containers that came off the vessel. It would not all be stacked in one, but these are the container stacks in the vessel. You arrive with your empty container. Now you have to take that empty container off the back. So there has to be a container carrier that comes and lifts that container off the back, put on a yard carrier, and then that empty container has to be stacked. But all containers are not the same. There's a Maersk container, but you may have a container from Yang Min. You may have a container from Hapag-Lloyd and Evergreen, and they tend to be different colors. Or they may be from one of the big lessors, Triton. But what you have are all these different containers. And depending on the terminal may have none of those vessels coming in anytime soon. And if you have the wrong color box, they may reject you. I don't need a purple box on my container because it's just going to take up space. So they will turn you around. But let's say you show up with a Maersk box, and Maersk is what they need. And so you arrive with your Maersk box, and they're going to offload your Maersk box, and they're going to stick it in another pile of empties out of the way. Now you need to get your container. Now you've booked a time to get onto the yard. Well, now they have to get your container. The problem is your container is buried in one of these stacks. And now you have to play Tetris. You have to dig into the stack to find your container. And you can't do what I just did here, is lift these containers up and just pull your container out. You have to pull individual boxes one at a time off and restack them somewhere else. So you get your container. And now you have that container, and that container now be brought ready to load. The problem is that's a set time period. The yard wants to plan for that. The problem is you may not be able to get in fast enough. You may be, because of the lines waiting in to get in the gates, not be able to get in, or because there's so many containers here, it takes a long time to get to your container that's buried in the stack. Or they may be dealing with your empty container and trying to find a spot in the yard to put that empty container. And all this slows down the yard. And when you slow down the terminal, because the terminal is so full of containers, they can't move anymore. Basically, it's full. That's a problem. If you did not have a full yard, then you can take containers off the stack, move them into empties, and have a lower level and easier to select. And you can move much more efficiently. And that's been the issue that's been plaguing the port of LA and Long Beach this entire time. So this scenario of all these containers coming off the ships in LA and Long Beach makes it very unique. And what we find is the container yards in LA and Long Beach are just slammed. They're just jammed. It's this huge, again, massive game of basically Tetris that you have to do. And it's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get loaded containers out of the port, because there's so many empties there clogging up the yard that you have to move so many boxes to get to the loaded containers. And you can't put more in the yards because the container gantry cranes only cover a set area of space. And when you fill up the yard more and more, it becomes more difficult to get to the containers you need. And this results in these huge delays we see coming into the gates of LA and Long Beach. Adding more trucks and more drivers does nothing to solve this. What we need to increase is what's called throughput, the amount of containers coming in. And that amount of containers can be handled by the drivers and the trucks that are available. You just need them to getting not one call a day, but 2 to 3 calls a day. So the question becomes, what is the answer? What is the answer to this scenario? And I would argue that these answers have already been said before. I am just repeating them, but I want to clarify that there's been some great work done. Ross Kennedy at Man Integrated, I'll have it in the show notes, did this whole aspect of this, talked about it. Ryan Peterson at Flexport. There are tons of people who've talked about this. But what we got to do is get the empties out of the yard. How do you do that? Well, you need a place for the empties to go. Well, I had somebody today ask me, well, why is this not the container companies, the container lines, or the lessors problem? Well, the problem you have, again, is the container lines. So for example, Maersk, Maersk is bringing back in containers, but Maersk containers aren't making up the entire complement of empty containers in the yard, because there are more containers now being owned by lessors, by these leasing companies. Why are these leasing companies doing it? Well, again, leasing companies want the containers going in different areas. So there's no one central place to do it. So my proposal and what I put in was basically a kind of leveled plan. I did this in the Twitter note, but I'll go through it. So number one, what you need to do is identify a large area near the ports where you can do this. Ross talked about using, Dodger Stadium, the parking lot of Dodger Stadium. Find a large open area where these truck drivers can take their empty containers. You route the drivers to these areas. You check in with the boxes. You have to waive detention fees now, because one of the things that's going to try to happen here is, because you're not returning your box, you're going to get charged detention fees. So you have to waive these detention fees so that the detention fees are not being implemented here. So you need to waive those fees. And then you need obviously somebody to man these yards. You need somebody to man these yards. You need to get the containers off the back of the chassis. That requires cranes, that requires personnel. And I would, in the short term, use National Guard and the military. They have container handlers. They have these rough terrain container handlers. They can offload containers off the box of the chassis, stack them, and you can transition this over to commercial operation very quickly. I think almost seamlessly you can start contracting out and have these yards managed by private contractors. You can lease the equipment or get the equipment from the National Guard or reserves to use. Keep track of the containers. But now what you've done is you've taken that container off the back of the chassis of the truck driver. Now that truck driver can make an appointment at a terminal, drive into the terminal, and just pick up their box. That's all they need to do, is just pick up the box. What's slowing everything down are the empties having to get off the back of the chassis and then clogging up the yard. There's over 100,000 empty boxes right now in the ports of LA and Long Beach. And what we need is a solution to this. And I am not taking credit for this at all. There's a lot of other smart people that have talked about this, but I am just trying to graphically demonstrate using Lego and pictures what needs to be done. And this is not hard, but it requires coordination, because you got to bring together ports, terminals, drayage, truck drivers, lessors of containers. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of moving pieces involved. And the only one that can do that, in my argument, is the government. They're the only ones who are outside the fray. They can come in and coordinate this. And again, most terminals around the world do this. They take the empties off the containers before they show up at the terminal. And then they have truck drivers just hauling empties back and forth to the terminal as needed and offloading them. Again, when the terminals are not as busy as they are right now, this is not a big problem, because there's not as many containers on the yard. But now it's the issue. And so we need to get this solved. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please subscribe, share it across social media, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos when they come out. Also, if you can, contribute to the Patreon page. That allows me to buy more Lego so that I can more aptly demonstrate to you how global shipping works. Actually, no, it gives me the time and frees me up from doing other coursework so that I can do these videos. So until the next video, Sal, signing off.